In the 1924 presidential election, 17% of all Americans voted for either a communist or socialist candidate. 2 elections later, FDR sweeps into power, and we get the Fair Labor Standards Act, we get the New Deal, we get all these social programs, and we get a reimagined role for federal government as an agent for improving the material conditions of the lives of everyday Americans. Does this mean FDR was secretly a socialist? No, FDR was a capitalist. He hated the term socialist, he rejected the term, but I think more telling, there's not a single piece of legislation that came from either of the two major parties before the 1924 election that looks anything like the New Deal or the Fair Labor Standard Act. There's really no argument to be made that FDR was a socialist, but I do think you can make the argument that he was quite the pragmatist. Because FDR said to the power brokers and the big donors within the Democratic Party, hey, look, if we are at least able to deliver the outcomes that the leftists are looking for, without having to do the underlying structural reforms that the leftists want, I think that we can still take the presidency away from Herbert Hoover. This is right after the stock market crash, and people felt that Herbert Hoover either wasn't doing anything or was only doing things to try to stand up big business. He wasn't worried about everyday people suffering. And FDR's plan works. He's able to take the presidency away from Hoover, becomes America's longest serving president, and one of our most popular still to this day. For my money, this is the point of third parties in the American electoral system. Third parties in America do not win elections, but they still influence politics. We just don't notice it because they influence it in a way that is behind the scenes, that's very slow, and that is often pretty indirect. Third parties is where new ideas are farmed and where new policies get test-driven. They shift Overton windows and break fourth walls. They don't win elections. Side note, it is not the fault of the third parties that third parties are not able to win elections. I feel like that should be pretty obvious. In a country where there's an appetite for 57 different flavors of fucking peanut butter in every grocery store, there obviously is an appetite for more than two political parties. Third parties do not win elections because it is mathematically impossible to sustain a multi-party system in the American electoral system. It's called Dave Fougère's Law. You can go online and read a bunch about it. The YouTube channel Primer did a pretty cool video a couple years ago where they showed how it worked visually. It was not an intentional choice to create a system that only has the carrying capacity for two political parties, but it is a choice to keep going with this system. There are laws that we could pass today that would start making multi-party politics possible in the United States. We can adopt ranked choice voting. We can adopt more fusion voting. We can create proportional representation districts. But of course, all of those things would require the cooperation of Democratic lawmakers and Republican lawmakers. And the two major parties do not like sharing power. That's how they became the two major parties. Now, I imagine that a lot of people have a hard time getting jazzed about third-party candidates because a lot of people would like to see the guy that they backed win office every once in a while, which it's a pretty good reason. But another commonly cited reason why people don't want to give money, support, don't want to register to third parties is the spoiler effect. Now look, I have no interest in trying to convince other people to think the way I think, but I also have no problem explaining to people why I think the way I think. So take this however you want to take it, but I don't care about the spoiler effect. I don't think about it and I don't worry about it because it is about as easy to spot out in the wild as Bigfoot. The examples that are out there are few in number and incredibly fuzzy. You have to squint to see it. I mean, for crying out loud, Ross Perot ran one of the most successful third-party bids for the presidency in American history, and for election analysts, calling him a spoiler candidate is still extremely controversial. But I do not believe that our fears over the spoiler effect are coming from a place of thought. They're coming from a place of emotion. We've gotten to this point where every single election in the U.S. feels like a matter of life and death, or actually is a matter of life and death. And when that happens, I totally can understand why, for a lot of people, you would start to overinflate levels of risk. Because when the consequences can be so disastrous, you feel like every tiny little thing that is controllable needs to be tightly controlled. But when it comes to the spoiler effect specifically, people's risk assessment is so far beyond what's rational. I mean, people are still trying to make the insane claim that third-party candidates somehow or another had an effect on Trump getting reelected, which is not even close to mathematically possible. Trump v. Harris was already one of the highest voter turnout elections of my lifetime and one of the worst showings for third-party candidates in my lifetime. Pretty much everyone who was going to show up to vote showed up to vote, and barely anybody voted third party. So there's just not that much material to work with in the first place. Trump carried all 6 swing states, and in every single one of those states, the margin that Trump won by was bigger than the total number of people who voted third party, except for in 2 states, which was Michigan and Wisconsin. So even if 100% of the third-party voters had switched and all voted for Harris, Trump still wins. But even that's a mathematically impossible scenario because half of the people who voted third party voted right-wing third parties. To think that third-party voters had some sort of effect on Trump getting reelected is literally claiming that you think that if Gary Johnson hadn't run as a libertarian, that 80% of like the white dudes in Michigan and Wisconsin would have switched their vote for Harris. Which, no. The spoiler effect is just not worth my time or worth my consideration. Gerrymandering is 88 kabillion jillion times more dangerous to democracy than the spoiler effect ever could be. Which is why in normal democracies, governments are not allowed to draw their own election district maps. They're typically drawn by like independent committees or civic conventions. But all of that is to say, I'm pretty sure all Americans of all political stripes are in agreement, are on the same page about the fact that like America does not do government well. Nobody feels well represented by their government in its current state. But like I said, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but I don't mind explaining what I'm convinced of. I'm convinced that that is a big systemic problem. And big systemic problems require big systemic multi-pronged solutions. And there just are no solutions that sound reasonable to me and realistic to me that don't involve third parties in a major way.